Moonjumper here with a special edition of Who Cares What I Think. It's the story that's gripping all of us, COVID-19, aka the coronavirus. Before I start the video, I want to do a brief preface. It's taken me about a week to put this together. I actually recorded the bulk of the audio on St. Patrick's Day. That was a Monday. And in that time, everything is changing so fast. The virus is spreading so fast, I can't keep up with the changes, and so I decided I'm not going to try to. Let's say, in the spirit of honesty, I'm keeping the original audio mostly as is, warts and all, and adding graphic updates to reflect where that information has changed or where I just outright got it wrong, as we're all trying to make sense of what is happening around us. For example, I fully admit I began the week extremely suspicious of what was happening. Mass panic, the full-blown shutdown of our economy, and weeks of a partisan media gleefully encouraging, fomenting a panic in an election year, which, by the way, I stand by. The political weaponization of this pandemic was happening and is happening, and that should be called out. But what has become clear over the past week, this thing is real. Despite the fact that it hasn't reached the kind of numbers we've seen from even recent flu epidemics, it is reportedly 3 times as contagious as the average flu virus, and it is spreading like wildfire. As of yesterday, I even have some close relatives in another city who appear to have COVID-19, and I'm praying hard for their speedy recovery. Nonetheless, the main thesis of my commentary remains the same. Don't panic. Remain calm. And don't let others panic you. Because in a crisis, panic is the most dangerous thing you can do. Episode 2 of Who Cares What I Think? The Panic Over COVID-19. Roll it.
Who cares what I think?
Moonjumper here. Happy St. Patrick's Day. Hope you're enjoying some green Corona beer out there. I'm here with an unplanned, I guess we'll call it episode 2 special edition of Who Cares What I Think. I'm still working on those Star Trek Picard versus Discovery series of videos that will be coming down the pike, but I felt the need to drop a little special edition to express my opinion about a topic that's a little more important than what I think of a TV show. Folks, I'm sure you've heard we've got a little bug out there. It's called COVID-19. It's particularly virulent, meaning extremely contagious coronavirus. Now, coronaviruses are not new. They're extremely common. We're exposed to them all the time. But COVID-19 specifically is a new strain first identified in Wuhan, China, for which our bodies have little or no immune resistance, and there aren't any cures or vaccines for it yet, because this specific virus, COVID-19, is brand new. So yes, there is some reason for concern. It is perfectly reasonable to take every reasonable precaution, and yes, any of us could get this. I could get this, but I'm far more concerned about my elderly parents, one of whom is already in very poor health, because it is far more dangerous to the elderly or other folks with weakened immune systems and other pre-existing conditions than it is to me, a healthy, able-bodied guy. All that said, well, okay, a little disclaimer here. I am not a doctor. I am not a medical professional of any kind. I am not a scientist of any kind. I have no expertise in any of this whatsoever. I'm just an average Joe who has to interpret the world around him through the prism of common sense and the experience of everyday living. Sometimes I get it right, sometimes I get it wrong. Who cares what I think? Use your own best judgment, take all reasonable precautions, and, don't blame me if you're sick saying some dumb Texan on the internet said I didn't have to worry about it. First, that's not at all what I'm saying. COVID-19 is real, and it is concerning in light of the fact that it is so new. We don't really have an adequate defense against it yet. That said, all I'm suggesting as a non-expert average Joe out here in middle America is, folks, please calm the hell down. Stop panicking. No matter how serious a situation is or isn't, panicking is never reasonable and almost always dangerous, even deadly. Let's say you're in a dance club. It's crowded and someone comes out to the microphone and says, "Folks, we have a fire. We need everyone to calmly and orderly walk to the nearest exit. Single file, please." In that situation, there's one of two ways this ends. One, people do exactly what the fellow at the mic asked them to. They calmly, without running, shoving, pushing, walk to the nearest exit and everybody lives. Or two, they do the exact opposite. The entire mob of people, they panic, each thinking only of themselves as they rush, push, shove their way to the exit, knocking people down and trampling them to death as they bottleneck at the doors that no one can fit through, and hundreds die of smoke inhalation and trampling one another before the fire has even fully spread. If this sounds familiar, it's because it's happened a number of times in recent years. Now look, I don't want to blame any victims here. God bless their souls. These were all innocent people, mostly young with their entire lives ahead of them, who never intended to harm each other in any way. Some died holding hands. They were just trying to get out. But when you panic, you can't think. When you panic, you cannot think. Panic is a natural human instinct which good, caring people fall victim to in dire situations. I'm not saying it's easy, but we have to learn from tragedies of panic. We have to call upon ourselves to control our most primal flight or flee impulses. But human beings have an evolutionary, God-given advantage over the non-sapient animal kingdom. While animals in general, and some are more intelligent than others, but in general operate almost solely by instinct, fight or flee, while human beings possess intellect, the ability for our minds to overcome and control our base impulses. And typically, we're pretty good at it. About 10 years ago, I was doing a program for a dinner banquet over at Texas A&M when an alarm sounded. It was a little startling, and I gladly stepped aside as an official came to the podium and told us that some smoke was sighted coming out of an electrical room, I think it was. It was a legitimate concern, something was overheating, and the fire department was called and needed to be called. You know what happened? Everybody in the banquet and the whole multi-story building, we're talking at least several hundred people, very calmly stood up, very calmly walked out of the building and stood outside. People kindly offered assistance, those in wheelchairs, walkers, what have you. There was no panic. There was no shoving. It was very orderly. It was very Texan. It's hard to say this without sounding conceited or braggadocious to someone who didn't grow up here. And I'm not saying that this is unique to Texas, but having grown up here, having lived through numerous disasters from hurricanes to gas explosions right here in my own community, I know the people I grew up among. We pull together, we rebuild, we rely on each other rather than the federal government. Texans as a whole are not traditionally prone to panic. At least they didn't used to be. But welcome to the year 2020. The pictures you're seeing here are from grocery stores in my own hometown, which is embarrassing enough. But this is happening nationwide, even in areas there hasn't been a single confirmed case. Here in Texas so far, as of this recording, we've had a handful of cases crop up, most of them in the Houston area, and if I understand correctly, most of those are connected to a single Egyptian cruise. It was a tour group traveling to Egypt, at least some of whom were tourists from the greater Houston area. And I certainly pray for them and their families for a full and speedy recovery. God bless them. But the moment these Houston area cases hit the news, and this was before Governor Abbott declared a state emergency, before President Trump declared a national emergency, although the stock market was already starting to plunge like something out of 1929, of course to the overt glee of the TDS-inflicted news media, who couldn't give a rip about your 401k as long as you blame the president. But the moment these local cases hit, people panicked and mobbed the grocery stores in my town like I have never seen in my life. Now, I live in a small community over an hour's drive from the Houston area. It's one of those towns where everyone knows everyone, everyone knows your name. I took these photos over the weekend and it was a mob. Even the smallest stores were packed with very agitated, panicked shoppers. In fact, moments after I left the store, police were called to one of those stores to break up a physical fight over a bundle of toilet paper. This is not typical behavior of residents in my hometown, which may have something to do with the fact that as I was walking amongst the mass of angry people, it occurred to me that I saw very few faces, if any, that I recognized. By and large, these were not local people. I strongly suspect these were people driving all the way from Houston and other metropolitan areas and wiping out all of our supplies and leaving the residents of my town with nothing. First, it was with the water and toilet paper. Now, the water I can kind of understand if people are concerned with public water safety, which so far there's no reason to be, but I could maybe understand that fear. But the toilet paper is the big head scratcher. I mean, from my understanding, this is a respiratory ailment. Now, call me uninformed, but I am not aware of diarrhea or dysentery being in any way associated with COVID-19. I mean, what am I missing? So the first couple of days, it was that. But then over the weekend, people started wiping out everything else. Food, dairy, as if they're going to be holed up in their home for not just days or weeks, but months to come. Are they going to freeze all that milk? Because I assume clear-headed folks know that milk and dairy products expire rather quickly, right? Folks, calm down. Take a breath. Before you randomly bulldoze every item off the shelf into your basket, please think about the shopper behind you. Hey, Houston, Austin folks, how about the local residents of small towns you're invading and leaving them with literally nothing to eat? Or even beating them up if they get in your way? How about that elderly shopper that you shoved past and filled your cart with that one little item that she was reaching for? Is this the same Texas I grew up in?
So, Saturday, March 21st, so it's a week after I started this video, actually, the supply chain has gotten worse, not better. I mean, this is all I've got in my basket. That's what I got to feed my family this week.
What can I say? You just can't compete with the Viking pillagers from Houston.
As I said, I am not concerned for myself. Even if I contracted COVID-19, the chances of it being fatal are extremely slim for a healthy, non-elderly person. In fact, I suspect, I'm not saying I know, I'm not qualified to know, but I suspect, just based on history, there will be far more people who contract it or even just carry it without ever being tested or diagnosed, and they end up being just fine and never even knew they had it. The danger isn't to them, but to others with whom they come in contact who might be more susceptible, and that's where the danger is, causing a terrible tragedy as we're seeing in a single nursing home up in Washington State. I'm much more concerned for my elderly parents, one of whom depends on medical equipment that has to be cleaned twice daily with copious amounts of vinegar and distilled water mixed together in very specific portions. And it can't just be from the tap. It has to be distilled to avoid mineral buildup, especially in our town where we have very hard water. You go to the store and there's no distilled water or any kind of water to be found. Pardon my bluntness, but most people do not need distilled water. In fact, for most people, the tap water ain't gonna kill you. It doesn't taste the best, but you can drink it. It's treated water. But I have an elderly parent who has to have distilled water for medical reasons. Fortunately, I am not panicking because I always keep plenty of distilled water on hand, thank God, because it may be a while before I can buy any, thanks to people who mostly don't need it, thanks to people who are panicking. Nonetheless, I'm tending to my elderly parents, I'm monitoring the situation and taking all reasonable precautions, and I'm confident we'll be fine. So I guess we'll call that the first topic, the panic itself. What is the second topic? What is behind the panic? Why the panic? Yes, it's a serious virus. We all get that. But about a week or so ago, I was flipping channels. Now, okay, to be fair, I will say this week seems like the tribal news media in general has been a little more well behaved than in the 2 or 3 previous weeks. Fox is taking it more seriously than they had, asking the administration more probing questions, while CNN, ABC, NBC, CBS, MSNBC, New York Times, Washington Post, the entire TDS Democrat Party mob have kind of tamped down their blaming the president for a virus to a little more subdued innuendo than the previous 2 weeks when it was all out, balls to the wall, calling the president a moron, incompetent, he's not doing anything, Trump virus, if you feel awful, you know who to blame, Don Lemon nearly having an aneurysm shouting down John Kasich, CNN's official grand poobah of all Republican never-Trumpers, for not being never-Trumper enough. While interestingly, I have never heard any of these brilliant anchors and DNC pundits stipulating what exactly they wanted the president to be doing or not doing that he wasn't already, except for the most obvious common sense measures for slowing down the virus, being of course Trump's restricting of international travel from China, Asia, Europe, restrictions on border traffic, etc. As you recall, the media and Democrats raised hell about that because that was racist and xenophobic. This week seems like they're actually toning that down just a bit. So I guess credit where credit's due. But about a week ago, give or take, I flipped to CNN, and amongst their angry panel of orange man bad pundits, there was this young millennial doctor, no idea who he was, doesn't matter, but they were taking him seriously as some kind of expert, profoundly concerned at how bad the president was screwing this up. Again, how, he wouldn't say. But this young millennial doctor looks right at the camera and says with a grave, straight face that this outbreak, pandemic, whatever he called it, was the worst outbreak in 100 years. 100 years. Okay, he is a doctor, whereas I managed to score a B in college biology 30 years ago. But, I'm still okay at math, and the current numbers of people known to be infected hasn't even gotten close to those of recent flu outbreaks, and he was there talking about worst in 100 years. He made it sound like millions were already dead, a la the 1918 Spanish flu, which obviously isn't true. So I was thinking, what am I missing here other than, being typical CNN, consider the source. But then the very next morning, I'm driving my truck, radio's on, and they're playing a clip of British Prime Minister Boris Johnson addressing the British people on the coronavirus. And I'll be damned if he didn't say the exact same thing. Worst pandemic in 100 years. And Boris Johnson is someone I have some respect for, so I'm thinking, what the hell is this boatload of gaslighting? This is obviously a coordinated talking point going around that someone slipped into Boris Johnson's speech, which is clearly designed to cause alarm. And sure enough, throughout the media in the coming days, I started seeing talking heads comparing COVID-19 to the Spanish flu pandemic of 1918, 102 years ago. That's right on the heels of World War I, killed 50 million people worldwide, including 675,000 people dead in the United States alone. I mean, you're talking nightmarish numbers, especially when you consider how much smaller the U.S. population was back then compared to now. 1920 census, about 100 million. In 2020, we're verging on 350 million. And so far, COVID-19 has killed, I'm looking at my phone. Now, I know there's some of you out there that might be a little bit more expertise in this area, certainly more than I am. I can already hear you yelling at your screen, "You dumb Texan, it's not about the current numbers, it's about the rate of..." Yes, I know, I get it, but just bear with me. We're talking about my thought processing, how I got to what I understand now. As of 3:20 p.m., March 17th, 85 Americans dead out of 350 million people. Now, don't misunderstand. That is 85 too many, and most of them are tragically from a single nursing home up in Washington State. It's a very tragic case, but this bears no comparison to the Spanish flu epidemic of 1918 that killed 675,000 Americans 102 years ago. Not even close. Now, left unchecked, God forbid, it could become that. But so far, and this is today's number, this is more than a week after they're already telling us that this is the worst bug since 1918. We're not even close to that. Oh, and by the way, the 1918 virus, they called it the Spanish flu. It was an early form of H1N1. Does that sound familiar? It should, unless I'm the only one who remembers H1N1, aka the swine flu from 2009-2010, that killed 500,000 people worldwide, including 12,000 Americans dead. Even if you are a millennial, which, newsflash, you guys aren't that young anymore. Even if you're a millennial, you were alive in 2010. So I assume you remember at least hearing about it. Now, I can understand if you didn't know that 12,000 Americans died during that outbreak. In fact, chances are that pandemic in 2009 to 2010 probably didn't impact your life whatsoever, unless you happen to have come down with it. You might have been sick for a couple of days, missed a couple of days of work, happens. Otherwise, you continued going to work, to bars, restaurants, you continued to travel. Between 2009 and 2010, I made several trips to Vancouver, Canada on business. Nobody was concerned about it. Nobody was pillaging grocery stores and knocking over old ladies to grab the last bundles of toilet paper. You probably didn't know that 12,000 Americans died, 500,000 worldwide, because the news media wasn't going out of its way to hype those numbers and blame the president for those deaths. Now, I'm trying to remember my memory's so short. Who was president in 2010? But okay, we're not supposed to mention that. I mean, we have been told in no uncertain terms that we will be shouted down. I mean, we cannot compare COVID-19 to 2009, or definitely not 2014, back when we had that big Ebola scare, and of course, a number of other much more common flus that killed 51,000 Americans. The more common flus did. In fact, since 2009, no less than 12,000 Americans have died each year, according to the CDC, and usually far more, in the tens of thousands each year in the United States. And yes, that includes under Donald Trump. Why is Adam Schiff still staring at me? Oh, right. I'm not supposed to be talking about this. Shh. We cannot compare COVID-19 to any other deadly virus because that would get in the way of our talking point. Worst pandemic in 100 years. So shut up, please, so Adam Schiff will stop staring at me. It's creepy. Okay. I admit to maybe a bit of a knee-jerk reaction to such a clickbaity phrase as worst pandemic in 100 years. After all, the timing is certainly convenient in an election year, and hey, it would make Bill Maher happy. I mean, he said he wanted a recession to get rid of Donald Trump. His words, not mine. Dana Bash is just one of many beating the drum for a national lockdown indefinitely if they can have their way. Hell, forget recession. At this rate, Bill Maher and Dana Bash can soon be celebrating a new Great Depression before it's all over. So, yeah, I was a little skeptical of the worst pandemic in 100 years. And look, don't think that we shouldn't still keep a watchful eye on those who might seek to abuse it. All that said, that's when I started coming across all these shouting headlines. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu declares COVID-19 the worst pandemic in 100 years. Now I'm thinking, whoa, that grabs you, or grabs me. Bibi Netanyahu is anything but hysterical. You talk about a guy who stays cool under fire, literally. And if Bibi is calling it the worst in 100 years, well, I'm thinking, okay, let me take another look at this. Although that's not precisely what he said. He did not declare it the worst pandemic in 100 years, journalist. Here is the actual quote from the transcript, direct from the Prime Minister's office. Quote, "It is doubtful whether there has been a similar pandemic in the last 100 years. Now, you can call it splitting hairs, but journalism is supposed to be about accuracy. He didn't declare it the worst. He is extremely concerned that this virus seems unique. He said it is doubtful. He's not sure that we've seen anything like this in the last 100 years, which makes it potentially very, very dangerous. But then he says, and this is the part of the quote that is key, and so naturally the part that CNN left out. He says, quote, "It seems the rate of infection is greater than we figured." The rate of infection. Now we're talking about something different. In other words, we're not talking about what is the worst pandemic in 100 years. We're talking about nightmarish projections. What could become the deadliest pandemic since 1918. The rate of infection. That's the key phrase you need to keep in mind. We're talking about how fast, how contagious this particular virus is compared to, say, the average flu. So that's what we need to keep in mind when we're talking about the worst pandemic in 100 years. This is a crisis, particularly in the sense of the panic. The panic is what is more dangerous than the bug. And of course, this is coming from somebody who has a close relative that is currently ill, relatives, his whole family, but their symptoms are mild, and I'm quite confident they are going to be fine. But we'll also be talking about how some in the media, certain politicians and whatnot, well, not certain politicians, but in general, are using this as a weapon against their political enemies. Let's be honest. I mean, it's hard to talk about the politics of the whole thing without seeming hypocritical myself. I mean, look, we all have our biases. I do too. We're always worried that someone on the other side is trying to use this to screw us. And in fact, how about a quick preview of what you can expect to see in Who Cares What I Think, Part 2, The Panic Pandemic. The city is basically locked down. The supply chain, of course, is becoming worse now, not better. We know that politics permeates virtually everything we see in the media. The only water available so far is actually Chuck Norris brand drinking water. But no matter what Dana Bash says, this cannot be allowed to become the new precedent, the new normal. What the hell are you talking about? So all that and more when we get to part 2 of COVID-19, the panic pandemic on Who Cares What I Think. I'd love to hear what you think. How about some calm, level-headed comments down below. And please, don't forget to like and subscribe. From deep in the heart of Texas, I am Moonjumper. God bless y'all and see y'all next time.